Hello and welcome to this session on technology tech wars. I'm delighted to welcome Joshua Meltzer, who is a senior fellow at Brookings Institute, and David Atkinson, who is the founder and CEO of Senseon. I presume I'm pronouncing that correctly, David. I can't say how privileged we are to have Josh and David on this call. Both have an extensive background in cybersecurity, trade, and political risk. And it's really exciting to be talking about all of this within the technology context that we've had over the last few days of this event. I think it's perfectly obvious that trade and trade wars have become part of the political and public discourse over the past few years. We can say what we like, but it was triggered over, the strategies undertaken by President Trump starting 2015, 2016 when he was elected. And over the past few years, we could really argue that perhaps trade has become a mechanism for understanding a conflict between the superpowers that's actually about technology and ownership of the technology space rather than about trade. So trade itself has become something of a misdirection. Underlying all of that is competition between the superpowers, as we're seeing with the Internet of Things and with blockchains and so on, around who owns data, who controls data, the regulatory systems under which it's based, and how we grow our use of digital technology in a safe and secure way. We've just come from a conversation in a previous session about blockchain, and the big question that always intrigues me is we're becoming more and more dependent on technologies. So what do we need to be aware of in terms of the cyber risks that this creates? As you know, our audience is financial services and banking, with a few others thrown in from corporates and from the policy domain as well. And so particularly in financial services, I guess my question would be, are we doing enough to understand the cyber risks that a move towards greater digitization creates? So those are the general themes, but Joshua, I'm going to start with you with this bigger geopolitical question first. And do feel free to interrupt each other. This is a working session, so interrupt each other, talk to each other. I can trigger questions, and also everyone in the audience, do please shout and ask questions in the chat as we go through. But Josh, is it technological or is it economic power that's causing shifting spheres of influence at the moment? Or is it trade power, or is it military power? What is happening to the power struggle between the big economies in the world?
Great question. We could probably spend the next hour talking about that. Yeah, and I'll just say, look, thank you, Rebecca, for the invitation and for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here. And these are obviously really key questions. And I'm just going to throw out a couple of ideas for discussion. I think there's no complete answer necessarily to this. I think that so I'm in Washington, DC, this is where I live and work. And so I bring a very Washington, DC centric perspective to this. So just want to put that out there, because that is going to color the way I see the world, certainly. But from where I sit, at least, this is fundamentally, about who's going to be running the world, over the next century. I mean, the reality is that post World War II, it's been the US in the driver's seat. Essentially, the US has been responsible for building the international order, the international organizations, a key contributor to the rules-based system. The UK has been a huge player as well, but really, the US has really been, the preeminent economy with the preeminent military, since over the last sort of 80, 90 years, probably longer. And, there's been challenges which have come and gone over that period. Japan, notably in the 80s, where there was a bit of hysteria around Japan overtaking the US economically. But China is really the preeminent competitor today for the United States. And it's evolved. It's a competitor with a very different political system to the US, one that I think people in the US hoped would trend, if not democratic, more liberal over time, but clearly with Xi dispensing of term limits and taking firmer control and centralizing power and exhibiting greater authoritarian tendencies, that sort of idea of where China might end up, for the moment at least, is certainly gone. And so we've got two very different political systems, two different systems with very different sets of values, and a China that's become very large on you know, in part on the back of, you know, its participation in the system, you know, in the trading system, in the rules-based system, you know, attracting a lot of foreign investment and capital. And now that's sort of, you know, one of the key elements that has allowed the US to be preeminent over these years is technology. You know, it's been a leading edge economy in terms of innovating and developing and commercializing always the next technology will come on stream. And China wants to be that economy, right? I mean, China's very explicit that that's now its goals. And it's using a variety of tools to achieve that, including, you know, some legitimate means by just trying to buy up companies in the US and the UK and Europe and elsewhere, but, you know, through, you know, essentially a cyber theft, and through measures which essentially try to build up its own domestic innovative and technology champions, and not opening its market to competition from the outside, and then hoping to globalize those companies globally. And so it is a competition over technology in that respect. The economy that essentially does develop the leading edge on particularly technologies like AI, and we can get into that as possibly over you know, what is AI, and we can talk about that. But the thing about AI is going to be a general purpose technology. It will cut across the economy. It will be used in multiple different ways, and it will have dual use. So it will be important for economic prowess, but it will also be important for military prowess as well. And so that's one key area where there's clearly competition, but there are other areas, biotechnology, quantum, and others, which are really going to, you know, matter as far as we can tell, where China is really focusing its attention on making sure that it sort of develops that and becomes a leading economy. So the trade bit for the US is really one of what are the levers that the US government can pull to try to address these challenges and that it has with China. And we can get into what the goal might be for the US in terms of where China is and how they interact with China. That's a complex set of issues, but, you know, it's a deeply integrated connection between the US and China. I mean, that's also what's very new here. If you go back to USSR days, one of the things during the Cold War was there was very little trade between the US and the USSR, where this is clearly not the case. And not only is the US economy deeply embedded, but a lot of the allied economies that the US relies on for the global sort of defense, the UK, Europe, Australia, Japan, are also deeply trade dependent and trade related on China. So it makes the approach to China even that much more complex. Let me just stop there and hand it off.
Brilliant summary of where we are at the moment, though. I mean, we used to talk about hard and soft power, didn't we, under the sort of USSR, US sort of strategic conflict. Now the delineation between those definitions of power much more fuzzy, actually, because economic power to some extent has become technological power, which is hard, and control of information. You know, there's this talk about sharp power or paradigmatic power, which is control of the way in which technology is developing. That's become a reality in US-China relations, but also in US-Russia relations, hasn't it? Because of the role that Russia plays in actually disinformation.
Yeah, and I don't know if David wants to come in on it, but yeah, no, I absolutely. I mean, I think Russia's a very different set of challenges. I mean, Russia is not an economy that presents any genuine challenge really to any of the Western economies. I mean, it's a relatively small economy that's getting smaller. It's very dependent on essentially oil revenues, and it's economy that hasn't got the stock of human capital is good, but it's declining. And the approach to information and innovation is one which is looking backwards, not forwards. But China can definitely create trouble. I mean, it's there's no doubt about it. So the disinformation piece is a real challenge. And there are China and Russia and other actors that are in that space trying to essentially disrupt Western democratic systems, sow discord, and reap the benefits of less unity amongst the Western countries, for sure. And so that's certainly part of the bigger one of the questions around how do you maintain an open internet with free flows of information, but also protect it from the types of disinformation campaigns that we see from Russia in the US and in Europe and elsewhere. But you know, but the economic challenge is not there, and the economic challenge, the one country that potentially presents that is China.
It's a strategic competition. David, go.
Yeah, no,
discuss.
Absolutely fascinating. Just where do you start, you know? And of course, coming from a military background and one that was really intently focused on sort of like cyber operations and activity, you know, I think to your point, Rebecca, it's all of the levers of power are now so intertwined. You know, you're talking about economic power, technological power, but then of course this influences military power as well. And you know, before we move off the wonderful introduction that Josh gave around like the background to China and things like that, you know, of course, you know, we have seen that in particular cyber sort of operations being used to really catalyze the development of China's growing sort of power base in their military. You know, the classic sort of statistic where the plans of the Joint Strike Fighter was stolen 30 times, you know, by different like sort of nation state threat actors, you know, to allow them to, you know, bypass all the research and development and just like catalyze their growth of like, you know, what is a strategic military asset. And so it's so interwoven. Technology plays a huge strategic factor, of course, the fact that we can reach out and touch people anywhere in the world. But it's so fascinating how each single, you know, one of those levers all contribute to like an even bigger gain of the collective whole.
So we're not really talking about, we're not really just talking about military conflict. It's all means, isn't it? It's something that is at a far more strategically competitive level. I think it was Angela Merkel who first talked about strategic competition, and she was referring to it in technology and economic terms, but it's bigger than that, isn't it, David?
Yeah, it really is. You know, there's just like so many factors, and you know, if I hone in on just cybersecurity for a second, the sort of strategic trends I think are influencing all other aspects, you know. So there's some key trends I'm sure that will come on to talk to the advancement of the threat. You know, we learn, we develop, there are tools out there available for download, more so than there ever has been at the past. So that's increasing at an ever accelerating pace. And we can talk about some of the activities of China and Russia in detail, I'm sure, in a second. So that's one big strategic trend. The second strategic trend is the complexity. We, me, you, Josh, as individuals, as organizations, and just society as a whole, we produce, adopt, and consume more technology, right, than we've ever been before. And there's always a downside to that, you know, and again, I'm sure we'll talk about some of those downsides, I'm sure, in a second. But certainly for enterprises, businesses, defense contractors trying to defend this IP that they own makes it much more difficult. The sheer amount of data. If I'm a nation state looking to steal data, there's just so much more of it around for me to take. And if I'm looking for specific data, it's actually pretty, you know, easy to hide within the noise, if you like, to get that out. And an interesting data point there is they estimate 73 zettabytes worth of data being produced in the world in 2021, you know, and to set some context for that, if 1 byte of data was the same as a grain of rice, well, 1 zettabyte would completely fill the Pacific Ocean of rice. So data is a huge problem, and I think we can talk about, you know, what does that mean from quantum and things like that when we get onto it. And then finally, I know you just come out of a session, Rebecca, on the blockchain, and this is in relation to maybe the financial services audience, which they may find interesting. So, you know, I think it was like Willie Sutton, the sort of famous bank robber in the US that was born in Brooklyn in the early 1900s, said when asked, why do you rob banks? He said, well, that's where the money is. So that same logic was applied also to cyber hackers in the 1990s. Well, they, you know, from the Russian business network, were targeting a lot of financial institutions because, well, that's where the money is. But the interesting thing about the evolution of the blockchain technologies is, well, you've got the ability to get money transferred pretty non-attributably, not completely, from anyone. So anyone can be a victim now, you know, and so that is having an interesting impact on some other strategic trends. So you know, I think, you know, there is a lot other things that are causing challenges that then nation states can exploit to increase their sort of relative power, you know.
I'm going to ask both of you this question because it's an experiential one, but it comes from when I was sitting on a panel myself a couple of years ago. The last time I ever saw anybody face to face, I think it was one of the conversations was about the conflict between China and the United States in technology terms. And they talked about two evolving internets. So Josh, you mentioned, you know, we have an internet, we have a World Wide Web, and there is a gold standard in the sense that that World Wide Web is something that we all understand. It's free and it's open, and you know, we would all say it's the counterpart of democracy, because we can get onto that World Wide Web and we can start engaging with it and share our data and do whatever we like. Is there really another internet evolving? Is there a different system evolving? And if so, in particular, that might be happening in financial services. So I mean, it may well be happening in things like cryptocurrencies and blockchains, where it's not as obvious in the broader space. But if it's happening, what are the consequences for geopolitics?
Yeah, I think so. Just when we talk about, I guess, the idea of multiple webs or the bifurcation of the current web, just to be clear, we're not talking about you know, the underlying protocols, but essentially the content that we have access to, where we've been used to content and data flowing freely and being accessible wherever you may be in the world, but increasingly governments are intervening in ways which means that if you're in one country, get access to only some content and compared to what you might get access to another. So China's obviously the, you know, paradigm example with the Great Firewall and its success really in terms of essentially walling off the country from content it doesn't like, and also, you know, exercising a pretty effective censorship regime internally to sort of tamp down on content that it doesn't like. And so in some respects, yes, we already have, I think, two distinct webs, where if you're in China, you've got a very, very different web experience than anywhere else in the world, right? So you don't have access to any of the online newspapers. You cannot get access to any of the technology like Google or Twitter or a lot of the Amazon services and so forth that we take for granted here, and information is heavily censored. Then there's a question, I think, and that I don't see changing. I mean, that is essentially about, you know, you talked about this in your introduction, I think, Rebecca, you know, control over information, and, you know, it is essentially a key tool that the Communist Party uses to sort of, you know, sustain control over the message and over what happens domestically. And then there's I think a concern is that there will be a bifurcation between the US and the EU, and that really has arisen primarily over the approach that the EU has taken to privacy, and, you know, it's other visions for what should or should not be allowed on the web. Now, I don't think that whatever the differences between the US and the EU are on web and data governance are going to create anything like the differences that we see between, you know, the West and China. But what I think we're sort of seeing, you know, more than a sort of a bifurcation within the West, at least, is you know, a maturing to some extent of the way the governments see the upside of the internet technologies and data flows, and also the challenges. I mean, even here in the US, there's a robust debate now around the need for federal privacy law, the need for more content moderation, and whether the laws that have underpinned that and allowed essentially, you know, the platforms to remain completely, you know, without any liability for the content on their platforms is a sufficient sort of basis going forward, and so forth. So I think we will see more expectation of content moderation. The question is going to be who does it. I think, you know, at the moment we sort of essentially leave it up to the companies to do it. So we leave it up to Facebook to content moderate. You know, they've got a court which essentially hears appeals on it, so forth. So they've set up a whole internal system of governments to deal with it. In Europe, you know, it's more, at least on the privacy side, you've got essentially privacy entities at the member state level and now at the European level that take responsibility for that. So I think that's where the debate's going to be. And so we'll see less of the sort of free flow that we were used to and more regulation. And the key question, I think, for the West is going to be, what's that balance? How do we essentially ensure that the innovative potential of the internet is there, while also tamping down on some of the more harmful elements of it?
David, I mean, I guess moving from that, is this a function of the types of technology that we're seeing? So are some countries evolving AI type technologies and Internet of Things type technologies more than others, which then means that there's different data that's available and different security considerations against all of that? I mean, we talk about cybersecurity in this sort of generic sense as if it's a catch-all for absolutely everything that we do, but it's more complicated than that, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it really is. You know, I think if you were to overlay the world with the layers and influence, you know, I think technology is going to be one of the most, you know, influencing nowadays, one of the most influencing layers that really play a part, especially, you know, goes back to my previous point, how we all love to produce, adopt, and consume technology nowadays. And so I think Josh makes a really key, interesting point around like content moderation. When you're getting, when you know, you've got this sort of bifurcation of the internet where, like, you know, so the people in China are receiving a certain message at a certain time, and of course, if you are a Facebook customer, and like, you know, what is their algorithms doing to feed you certain data? Well, what is that, and how is that making you feel? And of course, there's been some really interesting studies in terms of the impact of that, particularly in the US since the sort of last election. So I think that's really interesting in and of itself in terms of like its impact on us as a society, us as individuals. And, you know, like for over a decade, I've been analyzing the impact on things like privacy from a technological adoption point of view. You know, like our whole job, right, is to analyze data and to try and get one step ahead of how the attackers will try to exploit that data for their own ends. And most of the time we don't realize, you know, the impact of the technology that we adopt, you know. And I think, you know, if you look at, for example, China's advancement in things like AI, you know, and their investment into things like, you know, deep learning previously, and now moving more into quantum, and what does that mean, you know? And, you know, often, you know, the prize goes to those who can capture, retain, analyze, and make sense of the largest volumes of data, because that is where really the intelligence lies. And I was in an interesting sort of panel with someone who led a quantum company, and you know, he made a really good point where, you know, if there's a reason why China is capturing as much data as possible, like today, because at a certain point in the future, when quantum becomes a real reality, the power that will come from being able to decrypt that data will be like quite significant, you know. And so I mean, you know, there's so many places that you could go with it, Rebecca, but it's so interwoven into all of the comments so far with regards to that Josh was making about the internet, the content, and then what you do with that content when the next big wave of, like, you know, this next leap forward of technology comes, you know, and you know, quantum being one of them.
So taking that as a starting point, I mean, it's terrifying, just in terms of the amount of data that's out there. The other thing that's really terrifying is you realize how far behind we are in understanding the capacity of that data and the power of control over that data, for not just in terms of you know, geopolitics and how we run our tech wars, etc., and how we run our conflicts, but also in terms of how we run our daily lives. So we're not actually completely aware of the power of all of that. Even in the business sector, we've had conversations this week where people have said, well, this isn't the technology that's the problem, it's the data. So would your argument be, actually, the data's there, it's all there, we can do whatever we like, the technology is catching up with the amount of data that's there, and the issue is actually the data and the technology together give us this new technology paradigm that's emerging at the moment through all of these digital technologies?
Yeah, I'll just take that one quickly. It's not just the technology, it's not just the data, but there's the human layer, right? You know, there's a physical layer, there's geographic, you know. Attackers will always take the path of least resistance to achieve their aim for a number of factors, and actually some of them could also be related to technological power. Maybe they've found, so we just, in the last few weeks in China, there was a national level competition to exploit leading technologies, Google Chrome browser, iPhone, you know, and that in and of itself is a display of national power, because they were able to get full access to a most recent version of the Apple iPhone, be able to get complete remote access to the most recent version of Google Chrome browser. And so, you know, the reason why people will always take, or nation states certainly will take the path of least resistance to achieve their aim, because actually those are quite valuable commodities, you know. So you don't want to be burning a zero-day exploit, which we've seen multiple released in this hacking competition in China a few weeks ago, when you can actually just socially engineer the person on the end, you know. So it's, we've almost made ourselves more vulnerable as people, as like businesses, organizations, but yeah, it's a constant cost benefit analysis of education and re-education on the real true implications of the next big leap forward in technology for us. And often we don't get it right. If ever there was an example of, you know, this 2016 election in the US, was like, we just had never realized about the potential implication of us consuming social media in terms of being able to influence elections. And I'll leave it there, but it is more than just technology and data. It's how it all interacts with the wider global community.
And Josh, this affects the way in which we are understanding relationships between states, doesn't it? I mean, we can't think of power as just being control over data anymore, or military anymore, or technology anymore, or anything. It's the whole mix of all of these things together. And as you said, David, with the human layer on top of that, it creates it's actually the humans that want the power, not necessarily the technology. But I guess my question, Josh, would be to you. I was at an Anglo-German conference a while ago. And the German delegates who were there said, well, actually, you know, we're trying to develop our own autonomy as Europeans in this space, but we're way behind China. We're never going to catch up. So we may as well just admit that we're not going to catch up. Is that a valid strategic option?
Well, let me just pick up, let me back into that question, Rebecca. I mean, I just want to pick up on David's point. I mean, I do think the human element here is crucial. I mean, picking up on the 2016 elections, I mean, we've been essentially, you know, running in real time largest social experiment ever around on essentially, you know, everyone. If you take the Facebook population of 2.8 billion people, you know, we've been running essentially an experiment on them to see exactly what happens when you know, expose them to particular types of information, don't expose them to other particular types of information, have an algorithm geared to essentially putting forward the more controversial news feeds and not putting other points of view and so forth. And we've seen that societies, even within countries, can become incredibly brittle, and the types of you know, conflict and tensions that can emerge. And this is, you know, we see this in the US every day, but I think we see it really, you know, everywhere where there are sort of fairly open information systems. Now, you know, Facebook's exploiting that to some extent, you know, as part of its business model, but it's also a space, I think, as David was saying, and we've been talking about, where, you know, nation states and other malignant actors who want to sow dissent and discord can really manipulate that environment for their own ends. What we're also seeing is that, you know, it really matters if you can control the narrative, right? And this is something that, you know, if you sort of move out from beyond, you know, the what's happening internally, the control over the information you receive from about another country is actually very important in terms of how you think about the other country, how you respond to that country. I mean, we saw with COVID, you know, the Chinese government sowing, you know, misinformation about its origins, you know, seeking to blame the US military. You know, we've seen misinformation about the inquiries into the origins and so forth. And so, you know, there are multiple situations now where control over the information stream and the narrative is always been important for countries. I mean, this is not new, but the capacity to do that has really, you know, been ratcheted up quite significantly. So, you know, that piece of it is definitely going to be increasingly important in terms of how communities and societies understand each other and what that means for international relations more broadly. let me just. I mean, I don't know if I answered your question directly, but I'll just leave it at that for the moment.
I mean, I guess what we're seeing is a mixture between Lord of the Flies and 1984, aren't we? David, how does that affect the way in which we're behaving now? Because, I mean, Lord of the Flies was a social experiment. You put a bunch of kids on an island and leave them there for a while. What happens to the power struggle when there's absolutely no rules? How do they create those rules? And that's exactly the type of technology shift that we're seeing at the moment, isn't it? And then if you have the 1984 element on top of that, which was about national governance rather than international, at the point that it was being suggested that we might get to that position. Those two sort of sci-fi type novels or futuristic novels give us an indication of where we are at the moment in terms of the shift in paradigm, don't they?
Yeah, no, I really agree. I think Josh's description of this mass experiment is really, really apt. Again, coming from a sort of, I guess, like hacker background, if you will, not to use that word too lightly, but
benign hacker.
Yeah, this sort of, this concept of social engineering was something that was really applied to one or multiple people within a company in order to gain access. So you're essentially exploiting humans, and essentially what you're doing there at a very sort of microcosm level to the experiment that Josh was talking about was giving them specific information to make them believe really what you wanted them to believe in order to give you access, and at a very basic level, it could be carrying a clipboard and a visibility vest and walking through with some authority through the reception and into the back-end server room. But the point remains the same when you get to this level, right? When you've got the ability to control what people see, you've got the ability to control over a sustained period of time what people begin to think and what they begin to even believe. And memories, previous memories can very quickly fade, and that, exactly as you point out, Rebecca, is bloody scary, right? You know what I mean? And if you want to get really sort of fatalistic about it, and so all of these controls, I think, are long overdue. But again, there's just it comes back to this unforeseen secondary and tertiary effects of the adoption of new technology, and of course, this is nothing new. Like the evolution of the printing press and the church at the time, having the exact same concerns about this new evolution of technology. But, there is, there's some historic precedent here, is what I'll say. But it was never that pervasive. It was never like our lives and our, things that we rely on a daily basis was never that intertwined with it. And I'm just wondering if the odds are getting bigger and bigger as time goes on.
It's you're making me feel immensely cheerful. I think what I like to do is ask you both to speculate on something that's evolving within the financial services sector and within trade finance. Now, banks have been for a very long time very concerned about fraud. And very concerned about their own cybersecurity. And as they've moved to more digital systems, the threats come from all over. So, I mean, I think there was a figure during COVID lockdown that something like 5 million UK banking customers, banking clients, have been locked out of UK bank systems because of fraud attacks that had come from Russia, China, who knows where they could have come from anywhere. And so it's created this massive system, and again, a slight distrust in some of the moves that the banks are trying to make to move towards these more technology systems, which they're having to do for cost reasons and delivery reasons, and also an expectation of a younger generation, going to your point about what we're consuming in terms of technology, that this younger generation is expecting to be able to do everything on their mobile phone. So we've been talking about ESG all the way through the conference. This is exactly the same problem, isn't it? If you tweak one bit of the system, you're going to end up with risks in other bits of the system. So how do you see those? What do you do as a bank? What do you do as a consumer or finance? How much information do you put out there? And is there a government regulatory angle to that as well? I don't know who wants to start on that.
I'm not a financial services expert, but I'll make a couple of observations about the cybersecurity overlay here. one of the things that's going to be true, I think, in the cybersecurity space broadly is the more data you have, the better equipped you can to run sort of adversarial programs to ward off potential attacks. So I'm primarily concerned about the smaller companies that don't have the data, don't have the technology to essentially address the cyber challenges. So if you're a big company, if you're AWS and you're on AWS cloud, for instance, I think they're going to be about as well equipped to deal with cyber threats as you could possibly expect. But once you sort of rapidly move below that, then I think you become a lot more exposed. Now, if you look at MasterCard or Visa, for instance, so just taking the credit card companies, one of the things they do to address risk in the system is, for them, they look at the system globally, and they by analyzing, say, for instance, a credit card transaction in one country, which then sort of pops up rapidly in another country, or looking at withdrawals that are sort of deviations from the norm, they can very quickly, make decisions about whether or not a credit card's been stolen or someone's trying to hack into an account. And so, the underlying point being that, the ability to gather data from the system globally, that gives them a global view, is one way that they try to get on top of the risk rapidly and address it. So the 2 points I'm making is you need a lot of data, and you need actually data to move, particularly in a global system. That data needs to move freely. Again, this is something that the large companies do a lot of, and they do well. But once you get into the smaller companies, it becomes very challenging. I think at the smaller company level, your point, Rebecca, is that there's a genuine economic need and a good need to actually move to digital in the financial sector. We're seeing a lot of innovation in the fintech sector. We want to encourage it, making sure that it's small businesses that get a foothold and manage to do it. But these are going to be the most exposed. So what to do about that? I don't think there's any silver bullets here. And I think David's point about the human element we shouldn't overlook. I think we can get very fixated on getting the technology right, but actually ensuring you've got basic systems in place that make sure that people aren't, doing silly things like clicking on links and downloading documents that they shouldn't, is still one of the most prevalent ways that attackers are getting access to systems. And the other bit is that and governments are beginning to realize this, is that you need better information about the landscape of the cyber threats, and so you need private entities be comfortable about sharing information about what they're being exposed to and how they're dealing with it. There's a strong incentive at times not to do that. You don't want to send out signals to the market that you're being constantly attacked or that you failed to deal with it appropriately. I think some businesses are moving on from that and are more readily reporting that, but we need a way of helping the private sector, I think, cooperate with the government, who's often going to have better tools that they can then use to sort of address a threat environment. So cooperation, I think, between the private sector and the public sector, I think, is going to be an important part of getting on top of this as well.
So it's all about collaboration, David.
Yeah, I mean, just a few data points again for the financial services people. I was fortunate enough to be asked to speak at the Bank of America's Tech Innovation Summit, and the Chief Information Security Officer stood up and he said, I do not have a cybersecurity budget. I can spend whatever I want. I can buy whatever I want. I can hire whoever I want. And they had done some calculus with regards to what they worked out was, if they lose a customer, either through fraud, or not just through fraud, but also to these sort of challenger banks, this innovation, and I think it draws an interesting parallel, Rebecca, to what you talk about strategic competition and how these challenger banks were leveraging technology to get ahead of the game, beyond the sort of traditional incumbents. And so even with like they recognize the importance of being able to retain customers at all costs, because to win them back was like 3 times the cost to acquire them in the first place. So I think interesting parallel between like sort of our early discussions around like sort of national level power and then like almost becoming like sort of the same dynamics, but at a lower level of, big incumbents in the financial services versus these up and coming sort of challenger banks. And then I spent a lot of time with CIOs and chief information security officers in banks, and absolutely top of their agenda is digital transformation to keep up with the digital information going on in the sector. And this is a huge undertaking. It's a huge undertaking because you're sort of taking data from like traditional sort of mainframes and things like that, putting it into the public cloud. And of course, the Bank of England's recent note on resiliency, and hey, you can't just go into one public cloud, you've got to go sort of multi-public cloud to be resilient. You know, this scares the hell out of them, quite frankly, because it's a huge unknown with regards to how they're going to protect their data. And so it's being driven by competition. They know they need to innovate, but it's, you know, it's a sort of very challenging, big unknown risk for them at the minute.
So my background is in the study of innovation, and we always talked about Schumpeterian economics, in other words, creative destruction. And so what's coming through, we're hoping, is not going to be creatively destructive in tech terms, but is actually going to lead to something that's better. I want to hold you on that, because this move to digital systems and digitization, and you know, we've produced some of the background research on the economic case for moving to digital, because trade itself is manual. It's a process. It's paper-based. This is part of the conversations that we've been having. You know, we can widen access to trade and widen access to trade finance if we use more digital processes. And the economic case, you know, just the economic case, the cost benefit in economic terms is huge around the world. It amounts to trillions, because you're enabling access for all sorts of markets that don't exist at the moment, you know, in emerging markets, sustainability, etc., etc. But in order to do that, there's something called the MLETR, which is the Model Legal Electronic Transferable Records, something or the other, but it's the law that will be implemented, that's standard across the world, to enable the use of digital documents in trade. So I put something on a ship and I have a digital document, and that digital document is as valid as a financial instrument as something that I might hand them that's a piece of paper. So I used to be chief economist of the British Bankers Association, and I remember asking one of my colleagues when I first arrived there, so what is the most secure method of payment? And they said to me, a £5 note. So what risks are we running moving towards this type of thing? Are we likely to see our systems more vulnerable? What steps can we take in the sector to make things more rigid? And you know, to your point, Joshua, and to yours as well, David, we need to work together on this, don't we? It has to be something that's global and therefore safe, you know, that isn't going to be prone to hacking. It will be rogue actors rather than state actors that hack into these systems.
I mean, I don't mind taking this one first and then handing over to Josh. I'll probably take this at a more of an operational technical level, I'd suggest. But firstly, I'm a huge proponent of the digital transformation and the move to the cloud, and I absolutely agree with the underpinning cost benefit analysis is absolutely there. But taking a step back, just a second, you know, we call it the cloud, you know, and I love, you know, just to define that is someone else's computer, you know. So the first thing is we pay to put our data in the cloud, and of course there's probably a reason why these are some of the wealthiest companies in the world, because also then what you've got to do is to pay extra to get data, to make sure that your data is protected in the cloud, a sort of shared responsibility sort of model with regards to cloud security. And so I'm a big proponent, but you know, and I spend a lot of time speaking to security teams and talking about the relative risks of moving there. But, you know, we've had this recently with the SolarWinds hack, you know. So I spoke to 2 senators visiting London a couple of weeks ago who ran the Senate committee on the SolarWinds hack. And just for the audience, this is where it is suspected that the Russian intelligence agency used what is known as a supply chain attack of a technology provider to get access to around about 100 of the world's largest companies and 9 US government departments. And during the sort of Senate committee, the particular senator called up Microsoft to say, well, why didn't we have the data to find this particular attacker? Oh, well, you didn't pay the money that you needed to get the data to find the attacker. So there is you know, these companies are there to make money. So there's a tension equally for them to, you know, they need to do enough to make sure people are happy to do the transition to the cloud. But, you know, let's face it, the security division of Microsoft is a $10 billion a year business for them, you know, and so they need to also, you know, get this. So there is this like sort of slight paradox between, yes, we're trusting you with the data, but then we've got to pay, to get that. So I'll stop there for a second, but I thought some useful point.
Josh, what's your view on all of that?
Yeah, I mean, there's no easy solution here. I mean, let me just take it from a government angle then. I think that, one of the things we're seeing evolving in the US at the moment is a greater willingness, I think, for the US government to increase the cost of cyber attacks, both when they're attributed to nation states, but actually also when they're being done by criminal actors. The technology in some of these governments to trace the source of the hacks and to disrupt them is quite extensive, and there's been sort of broad strategic reasons why the US government has been hesitant to go after these attackers in a sort of a full-blown way. But I think the costs of cyber, hacking in absolute terms, but also the broader sort of risk that it sows into the system as we go digital, I think is increasingly changing that calculation for the US government. So I do think maybe one of the things we will see is that there's going to be an increased willingness by the governments in the US. I would expect this to be true in the UK, Australia, and elsewhere, to actually sort of essentially come into that picture and create costs to not only the member states, the states that do it also, but to the criminal organizations as well. So I think that'll increasingly, I think, also be part of the picture.
So we're coming towards the end of the session, and if there are any questions from the audience, do chuck them in the chat. But I'm quite happy dominating the questions because there's so many of them that I have. But as we start to look at the world in trade terms in a more nationalistic way, and I think that is a sad legacy of the last few years since the 2016 election and Brexit as well. As we start to see trade systems and trade agreements and trade alliances be renegotiated or put at the front of political agendas or the back of the queue, depending on wherever you are around the world, how important is technology within those trade agreements, and are we likely to see a more disintegrated technology set of rules that begin to emerge? Or is the imperative actually something that we need? Technology, trade, it all needs to be brought back together again so much that we have to focus at sort of international level to bring all this back into under a multilateral umbrella.
Sorry, David, go. No, I'll jump in after you.
No, I mean, I only because I probably have the least useful and strategic comments here, but there's probably like 2 points, I think, Rebecca, given the narrative and the lead up to the question, does it not make you pause to think that, because of the evolution of technology, has it been driving this more isolationist sort of approach, one, and what does that mean for the future? And then I think just only to agree with you wholeheartedly, I think it's got to be multilateral in terms of it's not just technology, it's not just security. I mean, you see this with climate change as well, right? It's all the nature of these sort of strategic agreements, particularly between the superpowers, it has got to be very multilateral, because what you tend to see with China is they come out in the open when there is a new emerging technology, and then as soon as they get enough information, for example, to begin to lead in it, then they become very closed door on it. And so we need to open this up because of the potential implications of all of the types of technological trends that we've talked about. So I'll leave it there for Josh.
That's the dual use element. Yeah, Josh.
No, I mean, I can just build on that. I think, this kind of brings us back a little bit to what we're talking about earlier on. Increasingly, if you see economies as being underpinned by data and by technology, that's also very much true of how economies interact with each other, to the extent that we are doing so much online, which is underpinned by a global internet, which requires global data flows, then that is very much, at the base enabling, new forms of trade, right? So if we, to some extent, what we are actually engaged in here is sort of a services trade, across continents. You think about the cybersecurity space is deeply a sort of a cross-border trade in a cybersecurity service. You think about education, health, you think about how manufacturing is distributed, but increasingly relies on data flows to be more efficient, to deploy technology such as robotics and just-in-time manufacturing, cloud computing is a distributed sort of technology par excellence with, data centers, geographically distributed across the world, and I can go on. So, increasingly we're in this world where so much economic activity and so much international trade activity is essentially built on the ability to move data globally. So the technology and trade bit, I think, is very much one of a piece now, and you are beginning to see now that being reflected in the way that trade agreements, trade deals, trade discussions talk about this. And the US has primarily taken the lead on this, but other economies that are sort of leading edge, like the UK, you see this in Japan, Singapore, Australia, and increasingly in Europe, it's in taking a slightly different approach for some of the reasons we talked about before, and looking to embed, very kind of intense digital commitments into trade agreements. So just to give you an example, it's pretty common to see now when the US does a new trade agreement, for there to be a commitment on the free flow of data across borders. It's very common to see a commitment that you're not going to require data to be localized. So this gets at a lot of these requirements that governments are introducing. The data has got to remain local for various reasons, which are problematic, some less so, but they try to get at that as well. Concerns, particularly in China, that you need access to source code in order to do business there, which is sort of another way that the Chinese government has sought to essentially, take technology from investors that invest in that country. And so to head off a lot of the problematic aspects, increasingly we're seeing issues around artificial intelligence embedded into trade agreements. So I think this is one forum, given the cross-border dimension of how technology is used and what it creates, that we're going to see rules and governance kind of being developed in that space.
It's such a complex area, but I think you're absolutely right. And I guess my comment on that would be, well, we had globalization where everything went across borders. It was the free flowing of information, money, capital, people across borders. We've decided that we don't like that very much. We've locked down we've locked down our nation states to some extent and become more isolationist over the last few years. But the fact remains that we are still interconnected globally, and we are still very much interdependent on each other's technologies, and that's really the connecting point between all the nations, which is why we need multilateral solutions. So I guess I'd ask each of you to just provide a quick summary of where you think we're going to be in 12 months' time. So this is called the Future of Strategy. This has been an excellent strategic conversation about how we need to think about new technologies and how we need to think about digitization and the challenges around all of that, particularly in a trade and finance capacity. I guess I'm sitting in a bank, or I'm sitting in a business, or I'm sitting in a policy environment. How am I going to allocate my resources over the next year? What's this time next year going to look like? Where and how do I get there? That's your multi-trillion-dollar question.
I mean, I'll take it from again, from a cybersecurity focus. In the last sort of 12 months, we've seen significant attacks that have sort of done everything from, obviously, the SolarWinds attack was probably the most significant cyber boost that we've seen, and had the potential, if it wasn't an intelligence gathering operation, to be otherwise devastating if it was something like a ransomware operation. And then we've seen the Colonial Pipeline in the US, which sort of brought and ground the Eastern Seaboard's oil supplies to a halt. I think my prediction is it's probably going to get worse before it gets better, just because of the adoption and the combination of legacy technology, the interwovenness of operational technology and information technology. So I think we're going to see, unfortunately, more of the same before the impacts of the executive orders and things that President Biden has implemented begin to have an impact. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree with David. I mean, I think that, whatever trends you think you see now, I think they will continue and probably get worse. Let me just take a geopolitical overlay to sort of bring it back to the technology piece. I mean, I think that, US-China relations will continue to deteriorate. I think that the relationships between the US and Europe and the West broadly, I think, will strengthen in response. And this bifurcation, I think, will have a whole lot of implication for when one thinks about economic relations and also the technology piece in particular. So, I mean, my vision in part, I can easily imagine a world, as you sort of, if you trace sort of the risks along supply chains and the increased challenges in the cyberspace for businesses broadly, you know, I think the SolarWinds example is a great one, is that you end up with these trusted sort of spaces essentially, where you essentially increasingly are orientating your supply chains and your trade to countries that participate in certain sort of trusted trader spaces which deal very specifically with the cybersecurity risk. And if you're not in that, you're outside of that and you engage in that at your own risk. And so, you know, this I think will increasingly become an inflection point, I think, for sort of the international economic system around essentially the cybersecurity piece.
Josh, David, thank you so much. I've learned a huge amount from this session, and I'm sure our listeners have as well. For me, the big takeaways are that we are interdependent, that there are huge risks out there. It's going to get worse before it gets better, which is immensely cheerful, but that there are opportunities of digitization and digitalization out there if we take them, but that the conflict that's inherent in that space, which is the strategic conflict in technology and trade terms, we're not going to see any sort of easing of that. If we are going to see an easing, it has to be one that we approach together in a multilateral way through the multilateral organizations. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this conversation. The audience has been quiet, but I think it's largely because they've just been fascinated by what you're saying. I'm immensely grateful. Thank you again. And to everyone who's listening, we meet again at 4 o'clock when we're going to listen to John Carroll, who is the head of international business and lending at Santander UK Bank, on SMEs and access to finance. Thank you very much indeed for listening, and have a lovely afternoon.
Thanks, Abby.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.